The first thing I heard that morning was the notification tone repeating itself like it was trying to warn me before the situation turned into something I couldn't ignore. I was standing at dock line 14 of Willow Bay Marina when the first report hit my tablet. 23 formal complaints filed against my enforcement division in less than 48 hours. That's when I knew this wasn't routine paperwork anymore. It was pressure, coordinated and deliberate, aimed straight at the structure we had been maintaining for 6 months. My name is Ethan Caldwell, Marina Compliance Director for 6 interconnected harbor zones along the eastern shoreline, and I've dealt with disputes before, but never anything that moved this fast. The harbor itself was quiet that morning, the kind of quiet you only get when the tide is low and even the wind seems to hesitate before crossing the water. But silence in places like this never lasts, not when people start turning jurisdiction into leverage. A stack of printed emails sat beside my console, each one stamped with Karen Whitmore's name, each one escalating the same claim that our marina operations were interfering with so-called community access rights. She wasn't just complaining anymore. She was building a case, and she was doing it faster than most legal teams I've seen in actual litigation. I could feel the shift before anyone said it out loud. The way the marina deputies stopped casual movement and started watching the shoreline with full attention. Somewhere beyond the fog line, Willow Bay Estates was no longer just a neighborhood on paper. It was becoming a jurisdictional problem. I placed my hand on the edge of the railing, feeling the damp salt air cling to my sleeves while I reviewed the latest enforcement logs from our deputies across all 6 marina sectors. Each log told the same story in different language. Unauthorized expansion attempts, disputed dock extensions, and quiet boundary violations that had gone unnoticed until now. It wasn't the violations themselves that concerned me. It was the pattern forming underneath them, like someone had studied our entire operational layout and decided to test its weakest points. Karen Whitmore had never been subtle, but this was different. This was structured, deliberate, and backed by something she believed could override established authority. The wind picked up slightly, pushing ripples across the marina water as if the entire bay itself was reacting to the tension building along the docks. I checked the secured folder on my tablet labeled Jurisdictional Boundaries, already knowing that whatever Karen thought she was doing, she was about to run into something she didn't understand. Behind me, one of the deputies confirmed over radio that another complaint had just been filed, the 23rd, time-stamped less than an hour apart from the previous one. That detail mattered more than it should have, because in my experience, coordinated timing always meant someone was trying to create momentum, not resolve conflict. I exhaled slowly, watching the morning fog roll across the harbor entrance, already anticipating that this situation would not stay contained to paper for very long. And somewhere in the distance, where the private docks met open water, I could already see the first signs of escalation beginning to form. I made a note on my screen, tapped once to notify all 6 marina sectors, and prepared the enforcement team for a level of compliance review that Willow Bay Estates clearly did not expect when they started filing complaints against us. The fog thickened over the harbor as I closed the case file for the morning, knowing the real decision would not be made in paperwork, but in jurisdiction. By the time I finished reviewing the first wave of reports, the marina had already shifted into a different kind of tension, the kind that builds quietly before any visible change happens. 6 sectors, all under my supervision, were now reporting similar anomalies tied to the same source, Willow Bay Estates Homeowners Association. I stood inside the operations office above dock line 14, watching the live feed of the shoreline monitors while my deputies began rotating through inspection routes. The air smelled faintly of salt and wet timber, mixed with the industrial scent of dock machinery warming up for the day. Nothing looked physically different outside, but I had learned over time that the most serious problems in waterfront infrastructure rarely announce themselves visually at first. They begin as paperwork, as assumptions, as people testing boundaries they believe will not respond. Karen Whitmore had escalated her filings beyond what I would normally consider procedural disputes. 23 complaints were not just noise, they were synchronization. Each one referenced access rights, municipal easements, or alleged interference with community water usage, but none of them matched the actual zoning records we held on file. I pulled up the original marina jurisdiction map again, zooming into the overlapping boundary lines where private dock access ended and regulated harbor operations began. It was precise, documented, and filed with the County Maritime Office years before Willow Bay Estates expanded toward the shoreline. Yet someone had convinced a portion of the neighborhood that those boundaries were flexible, negotiable even. That was where the problem always started. Not with force, but with reinterpretation. A deputy knocked lightly on my office door before stepping in with a printed update log. He placed it on my desk without saying anything at first, which told me enough already. The log showed increased HOA activity near Dock Sector 3, including unauthorized installation attempts along a restricted access point. I did not react immediately. Instead, I read through each entry carefully, tracing the timeline backward. The pattern was clear now. Karen Whitmore was not acting alone in a spontaneous dispute. There was coordination between filings, physical attempts at expansion, and digital communication directed at city administrative offices. Someone was trying to create the appearance of shared ownership over infrastructure that had already been legally assigned to maritime control. I leaned back in my chair and looked out through the reinforced glass toward the marina. The fog had lifted slightly, revealing rows of docks extending into calm water, each one tagged and monitored under our 6-sector enforcement system. Everything appeared stable, but stability in this environment was always conditional. My radio headset crackled softly as another deputy confirmed a new inspection request had been denied due to jurisdictional conflict. That was the third denial in under an hour. It meant pressure was increasing, not decreasing. I opened a secure communication channel and issued a directive for full boundary verification across all sectors, instructing every team to cross-check physical dock placement against registered maritime permits. No assumptions, only documentation. Karen Whitmore's strategy depended on ambiguity, and ambiguity only worked when no one challenged it with structure. I closed the file momentarily and stood up, walking toward the window where I could see a faint line of movement near the far docks. A small group was gathering near one of the older access points, the one that had been flagged for previous disputes. Even from a distance, I could recognize the posture of organized intent, not casual presence. My deputy followed my gaze and confirmed what I already suspected. Willow Bay Estates was beginning to treat restricted marina space as shared infrastructure. I exhaled slowly and tapped the glass once, as if marking the boundary in front of me. This was no longer about complaints or misunderstandings in paperwork. It was becoming a test of jurisdictional control, and every system I had in place was about to be evaluated in real time. The first real sign that the situation had moved beyond paperwork came just after sunrise, when my deputies confirmed visual activity at Dock Sector 3. I was still in the operations office above Dock Line 14, reviewing jurisdiction overlays on the digital maritime map, when the notification came through the secure channel. A group of individuals associated with Willow Bay Estates had positioned themselves along the outer access edge of a restricted marina zone, not crossing the boundary yet, but close enough to signal intent. They were not acting randomly. Their placement followed the exact curvature of the shoreline boundary markers, as if someone had studied the enforcement grid in advance. I zoomed in on the live feed and watched as temporary signage was being placed near a section clearly marked as federally regulated docking infrastructure. My deputy on site confirmed that no permits had been issued for any form of expansion, construction, or signage in that area. That detail alone should have ended the matter, but instead it marked the beginning of a more deliberate escalation. Another update arrived almost immediately after. The legal office flagged an incoming batch of electronic filings, all originating from the same sender authentication cluster tied to Willow Bay Estates Homeowners Association. 23 complaints now had supporting attachments, each one referencing overlapping claims about shared waterfront access and alleged obstruction of community maritime use. I remember pausing for a moment, not because the content was new, but because the structure was too consistent to be organic. No individual homeowner disputes generate documentation that's synchronized unless there is coordination behind it. I opened the jurisdiction file again, cross-checking it against the County Maritime Authority registry, and the discrepancy became even clearer. There was no legal pathway that granted the Homeowners Association operational control over dock infrastructure in any of the 6 marina sectors I managed. Yet the language in their filings suggested they believed otherwise. or at least were being led to believe otherwise. My attention shifted when a second deputy radioed in from Dock Sector 2, reporting that boundary inspection markers had been physically referenced by the group near Sector 3. They were not crossing the line, but they were studying it, measuring it, and testing how closely they could approach before triggering enforcement response. That behavior mattered more than open violation because it revealed intent to probe the system rather than immediately break it. I instructed all deputies to maintain observation only, no engagement unless the physical boundary was crossed. The goal was documentation, not confrontation. I could feel the weight of the system responding around me as additional logs populated the enforcement dashboard. 6 marina sectors operating under synchronized monitoring meant that every movement along the shoreline was being recorded from multiple angles, and any coordinated action would leave a traceable pattern. Meanwhile, another notification appeared, this time from the Municipal Review Board acknowledging receipt of the complaints, but confirming that no jurisdictional adjustment requests had been filed or approved. That meant Willow Bay Estates was attempting to operate in a legal space that did not exist. I leaned forward and studied the shoreline again through the reinforced glass, watching as the fog shifted just enough to reveal the outlines of dock structures stretching into the water like fixed reference points in a map that could not be redrawn by assumption alone. One of my deputies asked over internal channel whether we should escalate enforcement presence to visible deterrence. I paused before responding because visibility changes behavior, and I needed their intent to fully surface before applying pressure. Instead, I ordered continued silent observation across all sectors and instructed legal coordination to prepare a consolidated jurisdiction report for immediate filing if any physical expansion crossed the recorded boundary. At that moment, the system was still balanced on interpretation, but I had seen this pattern before in other infrastructure disputes. Once people believe that repetition equals entitlement, they stop waiting for permission and start testing enforcement limits directly. And as I watched the shoreline activity continue under the morning light, I knew that phase was already beginning. The situation changed direction the moment the third enforcement log came through, because this one was no longer passive observation. I was still in the operations office above Dock Line 14 when the alert triggered across all 6 marina sectors at the same time, a synchronized boundary notification that indicated physical interaction with a restricted access point. My eyes moved immediately to the live feed from Dock Sector 3, where the shoreline cameras captured movement directly along the outer marina edge. Willow Bay Estates representatives had now moved from observation to physical placement activity, attempting to install additional access fixtures along a section clearly marked in the County Maritime Registry as non-transferable infrastructure. There was no ambiguity anymore. They were acting as if repetition of claims had transformed into authority. I could see the temporary structures being aligned parallel to the dock boundary markers, not crossing yet, but positioned in a way that suggested preparation for expansion. That distinction mattered because in infrastructure enforcement, intent is often revealed before violation fully occurs. My deputy on site confirmed through radio that no county permits, no maritime approvals, and no federal authorization had been issued for any modification in that sector. I instructed him again to maintain observation status only, because escalation without documented threshold crossing would weaken the legal position we were building. But the system was already beginning to respond in ways that did not require my instruction. The enforcement dashboard across all 6 marina sectors lit up with boundary integrity alerts, each one tied to the same geographic cluster near Willow Bay Estates. That level of coordination from the opposition was no longer informal misunderstanding. It was structured pressure testing against jurisdictional limits. Another file arrived in the legal queue, this time escalated through municipal channels. The content was consistent with the previous 23 complaints, but now included references to community necessity expansion, a phrase that did not exist in any legal framework governing waterfront infrastructure in this region. I opened the jurisdiction overlay again and overlaid it with the physical placement coordinates from Dock Sector 3. The mismatch was immediate and precise. They were building their argument on space that legally could not be redefined by assertion. A second deputy reported that individuals on site were measuring dock spacing intervals using handheld devices, documenting distances between fixed enforcement markers and shoreline structures. That detail confirmed what I already suspected. This was not spontaneous dispute resolution. It was systematic probing of enforcement tolerance. I stepped closer to the glass wall overlooking the marina. The water below remained calm, reflecting the dock structures like fixed lines in a controlled grid. But along Sector 3, movement continued, slow and deliberate, as if testing whether consistency of action could override documented boundaries. My communication channel chimed again. Legal coordination had completed an initial review of the complaint cluster and flagged potential misuse of administrative filing systems to simulate jurisdictional overlap. In simple terms, they were attempting to manufacture authority through volume rather than validity. I authorized immediate preparation of a consolidated enforcement report, but withheld filing until physical threshold conditions were met, because timing in cases like this determines whether the response is procedural or decisive. The deputies across all sectors maintained position, their reports now coming in at shorter intervals, each one confirming that activity along the shoreline was tightening in focus rather than dispersing. I could feel the structure of the situation narrowing, like all actions were converging toward a single point of contact where documentation and physical reality would finally intersect. And as I watched the figures along Dock Sector 3 adjust their positioning once more, I knew that intersection was approaching faster than any of them realized. The first real collapse of passive observation happened just after midday, when the system registered what we classify as a coordinated jurisdiction breach attempt across Dock Sector 3 and Dock Sector 4 simultaneously. I was still in the operations office above Dock Line 14, reviewing live maritime overlays, when the enforcement dashboard shifted from monitoring mode into active alert tracking. Multiple cameras along the shoreline picked up the same pattern. Individuals associated with Willow Bay estates moving in synchronized intervals between fixed dock markers, pausing at equal distances as if following a pre-drawn map rather than reacting to their environment. My deputy on Sector 3 radioed in with a calm but firm update that temporary boundary markers had been repositioned again, this time closer to the waterline by a margin of approximately 6 feet. That detail mattered because no approved adjustment of any kind existed in county maritime records or in federal harbor zoning documentation. I instructed him again to maintain observation only, but by this point the system itself was beginning to respond faster than human input. The enforcement grid recalibrated automatically, flagging each adjustment attempt as an unapproved infrastructure modification. I leaned over the console and pulled up the full complaint chain submitted by Willow Bay Estates Homeowners Association, now expanded beyond 23 filings into continuous submission mode. The filings were no longer individual complaints. They had become a stream of structured allegations, each one referencing shared waterfront necessity and implied public access rights that simply did not exist in any legal framework governing this marina. I noticed something subtle in the wording that had not been present earlier. The language had shifted from requesting review to asserting correction, as if repetition alone had begun to replace legal authority in their internal logic. I stood still for a moment, watching the shoreline feed where the fog had begun to thin, revealing clearer detail of Dock Sector 3. The individuals there were no longer just measuring or observing. They were attempting to align physical placement markers with what appeared to be their own internal boundary interpretation, ignoring the fixed enforcement beacons already installed and registered with County Maritime Authority. A second update arrived from legal coordination confirming that the complaint cluster had now been escalated through 3 separate municipal channels, all referencing identical claims, but submitted through different identities linked back to Willow Bay Estates' administrative system. That pattern indicated deliberate fragmentation, designed to simulate broader community consensus. I issued a directive to consolidate all filings under a single enforcement case file to prevent jurisdictional dilution. Meanwhile, a third deputy reported that small anchor point markers had been placed near a restricted dock edge in Sector 4, again without authorization. The placement was precise, evenly spaced, and mirrored the layout of compliant infrastructure, which suggested premeditated replication rather than improvisation. I opened the jurisdiction overlay once more and superimposed it with real-time positional data from all 6 marina sectors. The result confirmed what I had been anticipating since the first wave of complaints. Every action taken by Willow Bay Estates was converging toward a single structural assumption that repeated assertion could eventually redefine enforcement boundaries. That assumption only holds in environments where no counterstructure exists. I turned slightly from the console and issued a full status synchronization across all deputies. Observation protocol remained in place, but documentation frequency was increased to continuous capture. Every movement, every placement, every attempted adjustment along the shoreline was now being recorded in overlapping layers across multiple independent systems. The marina itself felt different under that level of scrutiny, not louder or more chaotic, but more defined, as if every line of infrastructure had become sharper under pressure. In the distance, I could see activity still continuing along Dock Sector 3, steady and uninterrupted, unaware that every action was now being indexed against a system that did not rely on interpretation. And at that moment, I understood that whatever Willow Bay Estates believed they were building, they were already inside a framework that had begun responding long before they finished their next move. The turning point came shortly after the afternoon tide shifted and the enforcement grid flagged a jurisdictional mismatch that should not have existed in any active maritime record. I was still in the operations office above Dock Line 14 when legal coordination sent an immediate priority alert marking Willow Bay Estates complaint cluster as potentially misfiled under incorrect water authority classification. That single classification error changed everything because it meant their entire claim structure had been routed through a system that did not govern marina enforcement zones. I opened the full documentation archive and cross-referenced it with county maritime records, then immediately noticed the inconsistency that had been hiding in plain sight across all 23 complaints. The filings referenced shoreline access rights tied to public easement language, but the actual marina sectors were registered under private federal oversight dating back more than a decade. I could see the pattern now, not just in wording but in timing, because every submission arrived in tightly grouped intervals designed to simulate coordinated community pressure. One of my deputies entered the office and placed a printed field report on my desk showing physical markers had been repositioned again near Dock Sector 4, this time closer to restricted boundary buoys. The movement was subtle but deliberate, and it confirmed what the camera feeds were already suggesting, that Willow Bay Estates was testing enforcement tolerance in incremental steps. I stood by the glass wall overlooking the marina and reviewed the 6th sector overlay again, watching as each zone lit up with synchronized monitoring data. At that moment, I realized the conflict was no longer about complaints or dock placement, but about whether jurisdiction itself could be redefined through repetition. The legal coordinator sent another update confirming that a formal review had begun into potential misuse of administrative filing systems across multiple municipal entry points. This meant the pressure was no longer one-sided, because now the filings themselves were being examined for structural validity and jurisdictional integrity. I received confirmation that Sector 3 deputies had halted a new installation attempt after identifying missing authorization documentation for shoreline modification equipment. That report mattered because it showed hesitation on their side, and hesitation in these disputes usually means the strategy is starting to break. I closed the file slowly and instructed all 6 sectors to maintain full documentation integrity without engaging directly unless physical breach occurred. Outside the window, the marina remained calm, but the data across my screen told a different story, one of tightening movement patterns and narrowing operational space. And as I watched Willow Bay Estates continue their incremental positioning along the restricted edge, I understood they were no longer testing boundaries, they were committing to them. The next directive I issued was not visible to them, but it synchronized every monitoring unit across all 6 marina sectors into continuous capture mode. From that point forward, every movement along the shoreline would be logged in overlapping systems designed to eliminate any ambiguity in physical interpretation. I also requested a full historical comparison of all shoreline modifications filed within the last 10 years to determine whether this pattern had any precedent. The answer came back quickly, and it confirmed that nothing in the official record matched the current behavior emerging from Willow Bay Estates. I saved the report to the primary enforcement archive and watched as the system automatically flagged the entire shoreline cluster for elevated jurisdictional review, signaling that the situation had officially moved from observation to structured enforcement readiness across every monitored sector of the marina. The system-wide shift began at exactly 4:17 p.m. when the jurisdictional review status updated across all 6 marina sectors at the same time, indicating that the case had moved from passive monitoring into active enforcement evaluation. I was still in the operations office above dock line 14, but the atmosphere had already changed in a way that was difficult to describe without referencing the structure of the system itself. Every screen in front of me now carried the same flag: elevated jurisdictional review in progress, tied directly to the Willow Bay Estates complaint cluster. That meant every prior submission, every attempted boundary interpretation, and every physical adjustment along the shoreline was now being analyzed as part of a unified legal structure rather than isolated incidents. My deputy entered quietly and placed a fresh field report on the desk confirming that no new physical expansions had been attempted in the last 40 minutes, but that observation patterns along Dock Sector 3 had intensified. Individuals previously involved in marker placement were now focusing entirely on fixed enforcement buoys, studying distances without making contact. That shift in behavior is always significant because it signals awareness of oversight. I opened the consolidated file again and reviewed the entire complaint timeline from the beginning. 23 initial filings had now expanded into continuous submissions, each one routed through different administrative entry points, but converging on identical language structures. The repetition was no longer persuasive. It had become diagnostic. It revealed intent more clearly than content ever could. Legal coordination sent another update confirming that jurisdictional overlap claims had been formally rejected at municipal level and escalated for maritime authority confirmation. That meant Willow Bay Estates had now entered a stage where their filings were being actively validated against actual infrastructure law rather than administrative assumption. I stood near the glass wall again, looking down at the marina where the water reflected the structural grid of docks extending into the bay. Everything appeared unchanged visually, but the data told a different story. Across all 6 sectors, enforcement markers were now locked into continuous synchronization, meaning any movement along one sector was instantly reflected across the entire system. A deputy radioed in from Sector 4 confirming that a secondary inspection attempt had been paused after verification requests were issued for missing authorization documentation. That detail confirmed the pattern I had been expecting since the first escalation. The pressure was no longer coming from complaint volume alone, but from procedural fatigue being introduced into their system of action. I issued a full update to all enforcement units instructing them to maintain documentation continuity without initiating contact unless physical breach thresholds were crossed. At the same time, I requested a comparative analysis of all shoreline jurisdiction disputes within the last decade across similar marina systems to determine whether this escalation pattern had historical precedent. The response returned within minutes, indicating no comparable case existed within the recorded dataset, meaning this was structurally unique in both scale and coordination. That result confirmed what I had already begun to suspect, that Willow Bay Estates was not operating within misunderstanding, but within a constructed belief that repetition could override recorded law. I saved the analysis to the primary enforcement archive and authorized a full system lock on all boundary interpretation layers, preventing any external recalibration without dual verification. As I did, the marina beneath me remained visually calm, but every data stream across the 6 sectors now operated under synchronized enforcement readiness, indicating that the next physical interaction would not be interpreted as a dispute, but as a confirmed jurisdictional event requiring immediate structured response. The confirmation arrived just after sunset when the marina lighting system automatically shifted into evening mode and the enforcement grid across all 6 sectors locked into final review status. I was still in the operations office above dock line 14 when the jurisdictional authorization update appeared on my console, indicating that the consolidated case file had been accepted for formal enforcement action under Federal Maritime Compliance Authority. That single update changed the entire structure of the situation because it meant every prior warning, Every documented complaint and every observed boundary attempt had now been evaluated and confirmed against official harbor regulations. My deputy entered the office and placed a sealed notification packet on my desk confirming that Willow Bay Estates Homeowners Association had been formally notified of jurisdictional noncompliance and issued a mandatory cessation order for all shoreline modification activities. There was no ambiguity in the language anymore. It was no longer interpretation or dispute. It was enforcement protocol. I stood up and looked through the glass wall at the marina where the water had turned darker under the evening light, reflecting the rigid geometry of the dock system like a fixed blueprint that could not be altered by assumption. Across all 6 sectors, the enforcement grid transitioned into active execution readiness, and I could see the synchronized status indicators confirming that every marina deputy was now operating under unified command authorization. The first physical action began at Dock Sector 3, where deputies moved in to install compliance locks on previously identified unauthorized extension points. The process was methodical and precise, not rushed or reactive, but executed exactly according to maritime enforcement procedure. Each dock segment that had been flagged during the observation phase was now being secured under formal restriction order, preventing any further unauthorized access or modification. As I monitored the live feed, I could see that Willow Bay Estates representatives had returned to the shoreline, this time reacting to the enforcement presence rather than initiating expansion. Their movement patterns changed immediately from structured placement to attempted documentation of their own, but it no longer mattered at that stage because the jurisdictional determination had already been finalized. My legal coordination channel confirmed that the cease and desist order had been officially logged into county maritime records and transmitted to all relevant administrative bodies. That meant any further activity along the restricted shoreline would be recorded as violation of an active enforcement directive rather than a civil dispute. I issued a final synchronization command across all 6 marina sectors, ensuring that every enforcement action taken from that moment forward would be mirrored in real time across the entire harbor system. The deputies continued their work, securing each designated dock section with compliance locks that signaled restricted access status under federal oversight. The water around the marina remained calm, but the system beneath it was fully active, tracking every movement and confirming closure of each enforcement point as it was completed. I observed as Sector 4 completed its final restriction sequence, bringing the entire shoreline perimeter into unified compliance status. At that point, the complaint stream from Willow Bay Estates ceased abruptly, not because it was blocked, but because the system receiving it had transitioned from review mode to enforcement closure. I checked the final status update on my console, which confirmed that all 23 original complaints had been resolved under jurisdictional clarification, with formal documentation attached to each entry explaining the legal basis for dismissal. There was no further escalation possible within the framework they had been operating under. I closed the case file slowly and watched as the marina settled into stabilized enforcement status across all sectors. The shoreline remained unchanged physically, but every access point, every dock segment, and every boundary marker now reflected a single unified legal structure that could no longer be interpreted differently by assumption or repetition. And as the final lights along dock line 14 shifted into night configuration, I understood that the situation had not ended with confrontation, but with alignment, where every claim, every boundary, and every structure finally had to match the reality it had always been governed by. The final system confirmation came just after midnight when the marina operations grid shifted into completed enforcement status across all 6 sectors, signaling the end of active jurisdictional processing and the transition into archived legal resolution. I was still in the operations office above dock line 14, but the atmosphere had changed completely from the earlier tension of monitoring to the quiet precision of closure. Every screen in front of me now displayed the same status indicator: jurisdiction resolved, enforcement complete, shoreline compliance achieved. The consolidated case file that had begun with 23 coordinated complaints from Willow Bay Estates Homeowners Association was now fully closed under federal maritime review, with each entry tagged, documented, and permanently indexed within the enforcement archive. My deputy placed the final confirmation report on my desk, noting that all restricted dock zones had been secured under formal compliance locks, and that no further unauthorized activity had been detected since the final enforcement action window closed. I looked out through the glass wall again toward the marina, where the docks now sat under steady evening lighting, each sector aligned with clearly marked boundaries that reflected the finalized jurisdictional map. There was no movement of uncertainty anymore, no probing of limits, no attempts at reinterpretation. Everything had settled into structure. The system had done what it was designed to do, not escalate conflict, but define it into resolution. I opened the historical log one last time and reviewed the full sequence from the first complaint to the final enforcement order. 23 filings that began as coordinated pressure had been transformed into a single consolidated determination of jurisdictional overreach. Each step had been recorded through overlapping systems, ensuring that no part of the process existed without documentation. What stood out most was not the volume of complaints, but the assumption behind them, that repetition could substitute for authority. That assumption had collapsed under verification. My legal coordination channel confirmed that all involved administrative bodies had acknowledged the final enforcement outcome and updated their records accordingly. There would be no further review, no appeal pathway within maritime jurisdiction, and no reopening of the case file unless new physical violations occurred. I closed the system dashboard and allowed the office to fall into quiet operational standby. Outside, the marina reflected the night sky in long, still lines of water between dock structures, each one now clearly defined under permanent enforcement status. The deputies had already completed their final sweep and returned to standard monitoring rotation, confirming that all sectors were stable and fully compliant. I remained by the window for a moment longer, observing the shoreline that had shifted from contested space to regulated structure. There was no celebration in the system, no indication of victory or defeat, only alignment between recorded law and physical reality. That was the part most people misunderstood about enforcement systems like this. They do not exist to win disputes. They exist to remove uncertainty from space that cannot function under ambiguity. I reviewed the final archive entry once more, then authorized system closure for active case tracking. The screen dimmed slightly as the file transitioned into permanent record status, and the marina below continued its steady night operations without interruption. And as I stood there looking across all 6 sectors, I understood that nothing about the shoreline had changed physically, but everything about its definition had finally been made absolute.